It was Thursday, June 15th, 9:42 p.m., and Dr. Marcus Hall could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he gripped the steering wheel of his black SUV. The hospital had called him less than 15 minutes ago. "Dr. Hall, we've got a critical case. A 14-year-old girl in a car accident. Internal bleeding. We need you now." Marcus, one of the top trauma surgeons at Atlanta General Hospital, didn't waste a second. He threw on his scrubs, grabbed his keys, and jumped into his car. But now his headlights illuminated something that didn't belong in this life-or-death scenario, flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. "Pull over immediately," a voice crackled over a loudspeaker. Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. He checked the speedometer. He'd been going fast, sure, but not reckless. He flicked his blinker on and eased the car to the side of the road. The police cruiser followed, stopping right behind him. Time seemed to slow as Marcus glanced at the glowing clock on his dashboard. Every second he spent here was another second closer to losing that young girl. The officer approached his window with a flashlight, tapping it firmly. Marcus rolled it down and started speaking quickly, his voice tense but polite. "Officer, I know I was speeding, but I'm a doctor. There's a young girl fighting for her life at the hospital, and I need to get there now." The officer, a white man in his late 40s with a stern face, narrowed his eyes. "License and registration." "Officer, please," Marcus pleaded. "I don't have time for this." "She doesn't have time for this." "License and registration," the officer repeated coldly, ignoring Marcus's explanation. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus's heart sank. Step out of the vehicle? Was this guy serious? He gripped the steering wheel tighter, debating whether to comply or explain further. But before he could respond, the officer's hand moved toward his holster, his voice sharp. "I said, step out of the vehicle." Police pull over black surgeon, unaware he's rushing to save the police chief's daughter. Marcus froze, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. Not now. The girl needed him, and this officer was more concerned about controlling the situation than listening. And then it hit him. If the officer didn't let him go soon, that girl might die. "All right," Marcus said, taking a deep breath to calm his nerves. "But you need to call dispatch right now and confirm what I'm saying. The patient's name is Hannah Wallace. She's the daughter of—" "I don't care who she is," the officer snapped, cutting him off. "Ow! Now!" Marcus's pulse quickened. He knew Hannah's name would ring a bell eventually, but he also knew that eventually wasn't fast enough. Every second felt like a lifetime. He reached for his phone, intending to call the hospital, when suddenly, "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his hand now fully on his gun. The approaching headlights grew brighter, cutting through the tense standoff like a spotlight on a stage. Both Marcus and the officer turned toward the vehicle, speeding down the road, its tires screeching as it came to an abrupt stop just a few feet behind the police cruiser. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the car. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the harsh glow of the streetlights. It was Officer Grant, a younger cop in his early 30s with an air of quiet authority. Marcus noticed immediately that his demeanor was different, focused yet calm. But what caught Marcus's attention most was the worried look in the younger officer's eyes. "What's going on here?" Officer Grant demanded, striding toward the scene. His voice was firm, but there was no mistaking the urgency beneath it. The older officer, clearly irritated by the interruption, straightened his posture. "Routine stop. Driver was speeding. Refused to comply." "Refuse?" Marcus shot back, his frustration bubbling over. "I told you I'm a surgeon rushing to the hospital. A girl's life is on the line." Officer Grant frowned and turned to Marcus. "Sir, can you explain what's happening?" Quickly. Marcus didn't hesitate. "There's a 14-year-old girl, Hannah Wallace, in critical condition at Atlanta General. She was in a car accident. Internal bleeding. I'm the trauma surgeon on call, and if I don't get there in time, she might not make it." Grant's face froze for a moment as the name sank in. "Hannah Wallace?" he repeated, his voice lower now. "Yes," Marcus said. "She's the daughter of someone important, isn't she?" "I've been trying to tell him that." "She's the police chief's daughter," Grant said, his tone laced with urgency. He spun around to face the older officer. You pulled over the surgeon trying to save the chief's daughter? The older officer blinked, his hand sliding off his holster as the realization hit him. I didn't know. He was speeding, and you didn't think to listen to his explanation? Grant cut him off, his voice rising. You didn't even radio dispatch to verify his story? Marcus, still gripping the steering wheel, interjected. We're wasting time. I need to go. Now. Grant nodded sharply, turning back to Marcus. Go. I'll radio ahead and clear the way. Thank you, Marcus said, relief flooding his voice as he started the car. But just as he shifted into drive, the older officer stepped in front of the vehicle, holding up a hand. Wait, he barked. We can't just let him speed off without a ticket. Rules are rules. Marcus's jaw dropped. Are you kidding me right now? Move, Grant snapped, his voice deadly serious. If this girl dies because we delayed him, she's not going to die, the older officer interrupted, his tone defensive. I was just following procedure. And now we're following common sense, Grant shot back. He stepped forward, grabbing the older officer by the shoulder and pulling him aside. Get out of the way, or you'll be explaining this to Chief Wallace yourself. The threat seemed to do the trick. The older officer hesitated, then reluctantly stepped back, muttering something under his breath. Marcus didn't wait for any more drama. He hit the gas, his tires squealing as he sped off into the night. The hospital was still 10 minutes away, and every second felt like a lifetime. His mind raced as he replayed the encounter, the officer's dismissive tone echoing in his head. But he forced himself to push the anger aside. There wasn't time to dwell on it, not when Hannah's life was hanging in the balance. Hours earlier, Hannah Wallace had been on her way home from soccer practice when the accident happened. Her mom, Chief Diana Wallace, had just finished her shift at the precinct when the call came in. Chief, there's been a crash. Your daughter's involved. Diana's world stopped. She raced to the scene, her heart pounding, and found Hannah trapped in the wreckage, unconscious but breathing. Paramedics worked quickly to stabilize her, but the damage was severe. By the time they reached the hospital, doctors were prepping for emergency surgery. They told Diana one thing: we need Dr. Hall. He's the best. Diana had heard of Dr. Marcus Hall, a brilliant trauma surgeon known for performing miracles in the operating room. But as the minutes ticked by, anxiety gnawed at her. Where was he? What was taking so long? Back in the car, Marcus weaved through traffic, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. His phone buzzed in the passenger seat, and he glanced at the screen. It was the hospital. Dr. Hall, he answered, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Doctor, where are you? The nurse on the other end sounded frantic. We're losing her. We've done everything we can, but she needs surgery now. I'm 5 minutes out, Marcus said. Prep the ore. I'll be there. He hung up and pressed harder on the gas, his mind zeroed in on the task ahead. He couldn't fail. Not this time. At the hospital, Diana paced the waiting room, her hands shaking. Her deputy stood nearby, trying to offer words of comfort, but nothing could ease the ache in her chest. She'd spent her entire career protecting others, but now, when her own daughter needed saving, all she could do was wait. The double doors burst open, and Marcus stormed in, his scrub still slightly wrinkled from rushing out of his house earlier. Where's the ore? He barked at the nearest nurse. Second floor, she replied, already leading the way. Diana stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Marcus. Are you Dr. Hall? Yes, he said, not stopping. I'm here to save your daughter. The hospital hallway felt like a battlefield, filled with hurried footsteps, distant beeps, and anxious murmurs. Dr. Marcus Hall entered the operating room with laser-sharp focus, pushing all the chaos of the night, especially the traffic stop, out of his mind. Hannah Wallace lay unconscious on the operating table, surrounded by nurses and assistants who had prepped her as much as they could. The clock was ticking. Vitals? Marcus asked briskly, pulling on his gloves and mask. BP is dropping, fast, a nurse replied. Heart rate is unstable. Marcus nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the monitors. She's losing too much blood. Let's move. The team sprang into action, each person falling into their role seamlessly. Marcus worked with precision, his hands steady as he made the first incision. Every movement was a fight against the clock. He knew that Hannah's injuries were severe, but he also knew what he was capable of. This was what he did, saving lives when the odds seemed impossible. Clamp that artery, he instructed. We need to stop the bleed before her pressure crashes. Outside the OR, Chief Diana Wallace sat in the waiting room, gripping her radio tightly. The voice on the other end of the line was one of her senior officers, and what he was saying made her stomach churn. Chief, we've received a report about a traffic stop involving Dr. Marcus Hall, the officer said. Apparently, he was delayed on his way to the hospital. Diana's grip tightened. Delayed? What are you talking about? One of our officers pulled him over for speeding. It sounds like there was some confusion. Who? Diana demanded, her voice cold. Which officer? Officer Carter, ma'am. And Officer Grant intervened to let Dr. Hall go. Diana closed her eyes, anger and disbelief washing over her. Carter was one of her older officers, a man she'd had trouble with before. She had warned him repeatedly about his behavior, but he always seemed to skirt just inside the line of acceptable conduct. Her voice was sharp when she finally spoke. Carter. Of course it was him. Yes, ma'am, the officer replied hesitantly. What do you want us to do? Diana stood, her movements stiff and controlled. Give me everything, body cam footage, dash cam footage, and statements from both officers. I want a full report on my desk by morning. Yes, Chief. She ended the call and looked toward the OR doors, her heart heavy. Her daughter's life hung in the balance, and now she had to deal with the fact that one of her own officers had put it at risk. She'd spent years trying to build trust between her department and the community, and this incident felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. Earlier that evening, Officer Carter had been patrolling the quiet streets of Atlanta when he spotted a black SUV speeding past him. It was late, and the roads were mostly empty, so the vehicle stood out. Carter flipped on his lights and followed, not knowing or caring who was behind the wheel. When the SUV pulled over, Carter approached the driver's side window, his flashlight shining in. Marcus Hall's calm, yet urgent explanation didn't register with Carter. All he saw was a black man driving fast, and his instincts told him to assert control. You were going 20 miles over the speed limit, Carter had said, ignoring Marcus's pleas. That's reckless driving. Officer, I already told you, Marcus had replied, his frustration mounting. I'm a doctor. I'm on my way to save a patient. Call dispatch if you don't believe me. But Carter hadn't called dispatch. He hadn't even considered it. Instead, he had treated Marcus like a threat, escalating the situation until Officer Grant arrived to defuse it. And now, Carter's actions were coming back to haunt him. Back at the hospital, inside the OR, Marcus was in the zone. Every decision, every movement was deliberate. He had clamped the ruptured artery and was working to repair the internal damage caused by the crash. Pressures stabilizing, the nurse reported, her voice filled with cautious optimism. Good, Marcus said, his voice steady. Let's keep it that way. Monitor her vitals closely. She's not out of the woods yet. The tension in the room began to ease, but Marcus didn't let himself relax. Not yet. He knew how quickly things could turn, and he wasn't going to celebrate until he was certain Hannah was safe. In the waiting room, Diana paced back and forth, her mind racing. She had spent her entire career trying to change the culture of policing to make her department a model of fairness and accountability. And now this. Her own daughter's life endangered because of the very biases she had fought against. Her radio crackled again. Chief Wallace, we've got the footage. Do you want it sent to your office? No, she replied firmly. Send it here. Now. Moments later, a file pinged on her phone. Diana sat down and opened it, her heart sinking as she watched the body cam footage. She saw Marcus explaining himself calmly, saw Carter dismissing him, and saw the moment when Grant finally intervened. The coldness in Carter's voice made her stomach turn. Diana clenched her jaw. This wasn't just about her daughter. This was about a system that allowed officers like Carter to act with impunity. She had to act, both as a mother and as a leader. In the OR, bleeding's under control, Marcus announced. Let's close her up. The team moved swiftly, each step carefully coordinated. Marcus felt the weight of the night beginning to lift as he sutured the final incision. When the monitors showed stable vitals, he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Good work, everyone," he said, stepping back. "She's gonna make it." The room erupted in quiet cheers, but Marcus didn't linger to celebrate. He peeled off his gloves and exited the OR, his mind already shifting to what came next. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw Chief Wallace standing there, her face a mixture of relief and fury. "She's stable," Marcus said, his voice gentle. "She's going to be okay." Diana exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. But her expression quickly hardened. "Thank you, Dr. Hall. Now, I need to ask you something." Marcus frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What is it?" Diana's eyes locked onto his. "What exactly happened when you were pulled over?" The moment Officer Carter walked into the hospital, the air in the waiting room thickened with tension. His usual smug demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of nervousness that made Marcus's eyebrows raise. Chief Diana Wallace turned sharply toward him, her expression unreadable, though her clenched fists told a different story. "Officer Carter," she said coolly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that could silence an entire precinct. "What are you doing here?" Carter swallowed hard, his hand reflexively touching the brim of his hat before dropping to his side. I came to check on your daughter, ma'am. I heard she was in surgery." Diana took a step closer, her gaze narrowing. "Is that right? Or are you here because you realized you made a mistake tonight?" Carter flinched, his face growing red. "I was just doing my job, Chief." "Your job?" Diana's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Your job was to serve and protect, not to delay the doctor who was trying to save my daughter's life. Do you have any idea what could have happened if Dr. Hall hadn't made it here in time?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'll tell you what could have happened," he said. "Hannah could have died. That's what was on the line while you stood there ignoring everything I said." Carter looked at Marcus, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't know who you were. You were speeding, and I told you why." Marcus snapped, his frustration boiling over. "But you didn't care. You didn't even consider that I might be telling the truth." "Why is that, Officer Carter? What made you assume I was a liar instead of someone trying to save a life?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't answer. Diana crossed her arms, her expression cold. "I'm waiting, Carter." Carter hesitated, his gaze flickering between Diana and Marcus. "I didn't know it was your daughter, ma'am." "If I had," Diana's voice rose, cutting him off. "That's your excuse? If you'd known it was my daughter, you would have acted differently? What about every other person you've pulled over? Every other situation where you let your assumptions guide your decisions? Do their lives matter less because they're not connected to someone important?" Carter's face turned a deeper shade of red, but he still didn't speak. Marcus could see the cracks forming in his facade, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Earlier that evening, while Marcus was racing to the hospital, Carter had driven back to the precinct, thinking nothing of the interaction. It wasn't until Officer Grant returned and explained the situation that Carter started to realize the gravity of what he'd done. "You pulled over the doctor trying to save Chief Wallace's daughter?" Grant had said, his voice laced with disbelief. "Do you have any idea how bad that looks?" Carter had brushed it off at first, muttering something about protocols and rules. But as the reality sank in, panic started to creep in. He knew Diana Wallace's reputation. She was a no-nonsense leader who didn't tolerate misconduct. If she found out about this, his career could be over. Still, Carter told himself he had been in the right. He hadn't known who Marcus was. He was just doing his job. But as the hours passed, that justification started to feel hollow, even to him. Back at the hospital, "I didn't mean for any harm to come to your daughter," Carter said finally, his voice quiet. "I was following protocol." "No," Diana said, shaking her head. "You were following your biases. You saw a black man in a nice car, and you made a decision about who he was before you even spoke to him. And that decision almost cost my daughter her life." Carter looked at the ground, shame creeping across his face. "I'm sorry," he muttered. Marcus stared at him, his expression a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "Your apology doesn't change what happened. It doesn't undo the time I lost because of you." Diana took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady herself. Carter, I want your badge on my desk by the end of the night. I'll be filing an official report about this incident. And believe me, there will be consequences. Carter's head snapped up, his face pale. Chief, please. I've served this department for 20 years. And in 20 years, you should have learned better, Diana said firmly. This isn't just about my daughter. It's about every person who's been mistreated because you let your prejudice cloud your judgment. You don't deserve that badge anymore. Carter opened his mouth to argue, but a sharp look from Diana stopped him in his tracks. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he turned and walked out of the hospital without another word. In the waiting room, the tension in the room didn't dissipate even after Carter left. Diana sat down heavily, her head in her hands. Marcus sat across from her, silent for a moment before speaking. I appreciate what you just did, he said softly. But this isn't just about one officer. It's a bigger problem. I know, Diana said, her voice muffled. She looked up, her eyes red with unshed tears. And I've been fighting it my entire career. But tonight it hit home in a way I wasn't prepared for. Marcus nodded, understanding her pain. Hannah's going to be okay, he said gently. That's what matters right now. Diana gave him a small, grateful smile. Thank you, Dr. Hall, for everything. Just then, a nurse stepped into the waiting room. Chief Wallace, she said, your daughter is awake. You can see her now. Diana stood quickly, her heart pounding. She turned to Marcus. Will you come with me? I think she should meet the man who saved her life. Marcus hesitated, unsure if it was his place, but Diana's determined expression left no room for argument. He nodded, and together they walked toward Hannah's room. Diana froze in her tracks, her hand hovering over the door to Hannah's room. Her heart, which had just begun to settle after hearing that her daughter was awake, now thundered in her chest. What incident? She asked sharply, her voice laced with both fear and frustration. The nurse shifted uncomfortably. I don't know the full details, Chief, but the precinct radioed in. They said Officer Carter. Well, he didn't make it home. Diana's brow furrowed. What do you mean, he didn't make it home? The nurse lowered her voice. There was a car accident. They found his vehicle on the side of the highway. Single-car crash. Paramedics are on the scene now, but... Diana inhaled sharply, her stomach twisting. Carter's face flashed in her mind, his pale expression, his trembling hands, his desperate apology. Despite everything he'd done, she didn't want this. Is he alive? Diana asked, her voice steadier than she felt. They're working on him, the nurse replied. That's all I know. Diana turned to Marcus, who was watching her with a concerned expression. Go ahead, she said quietly. Talk to Hannah. I need to handle this. Marcus hesitated. Are you sure? I can wait. She shook her head. No, she needs to meet you. And I need a moment. Marcus nodded, understanding, and watched as Diana walked briskly down the hall, her posture rigid. Then he turned to the door, exhaled slowly, and pushed it open. Inside Hannah's room, Hannah Wallace looked small in the hospital bed, her pale face framed by a tangle of messy blonde hair. An oxygen tube rested under her nose, and in 4 lines snaked from her arm to a machine that beeped steadily beside her. But her eyes, blue and bright, sparkled with life as they met Marcus's. You must be Dr. Hall, she said, her voice raspy but strong. I am, Marcus replied with a small smile. And you must be the toughest 14-year-old I've ever met. Hannah chuckled weakly, the sound lifting some of the weight in Marcus's chest. That's what my mom says, too. She's probably pacing around, isn't she? Marcus smiled. She's handling some things, but she'll be back soon. She's been by your side all night. Hannah's expression softened. She's always like that. She's tough, but she cares so much. Marcus nodded, stepping closer to her bed. You're lucky to have her. And she's lucky to have you. Hannah tilted her head, studying him. Mom told me you're the one who saved me. Thank you. Marcus's smile faded slightly. It was close, he admitted. Closer than it should have been. What do you mean? She asked, her brow furrowing. It's a long story, Marcus said, his tone measured. But the important thing is that you're okay now. Back at the precinct. Diana arrived at the precinct to find her deputy, Captain Ramirez, waiting for her. His expression was grim. "Chief," he said, falling into step beside her as they walked toward her office. "I just got off the phone with the scene commander. Carter didn't make it." Diana stopped in her tracks, closing her eyes for a moment. She'd been bracing for the worst, but hearing it confirmed still hit like a punch to the gut. "Do we know what happened?" she asked, her voice calm but tight. Ramirez hesitated. "Not yet. The car went off the road, hit a tree. No skid marks, no sign of another vehicle. It could have been an accident, or something else." "Something else?" Diana's eyes narrowed. "You think it was deliberate?" Ramirez shrugged. "We don't know, but Carter was under a lot of pressure. Word got out about what happened with Dr. Hall. Officers were talking. He wasn't exactly popular after tonight." Diana sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I want a full investigation. Treat this like any other case. No assumptions, no shortcuts." "Understood?" "Understood, Chief." Later that night, Diana returned to the hospital after leaving Ramirez with clear instructions. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she couldn't stay away from Hannah any longer. When she entered her daughter's room, she found Marcus sitting beside the bed, talking quietly with Hannah. They both looked up as she walked in, and Hannah's face lit up. "Mom," she said, her voice stronger now. "Dr. Hall was just telling me how brave I was." Diana smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's right. You're the bravest person I know." She walked over and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She's got a lot of fight in her. She'll be just fine." Hannah tilted her head. "What's wrong, Mom? You look worried." Diana hesitated, then sat down beside her daughter. "There's been a lot going on tonight, sweetheart. But none of it matters as much as you being okay." Hannah frowned, but didn't press further. Marcus decided to give them some privacy and stood to leave. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he said to Hannah. "Get some rest." As Marcus walked out of the room, he passed a nurse carrying a folder. She paused, looking at him hesitantly. "Dr. Hall?" "Yes." Marcus replied. "This just came in for you," she said, handing him the folder. "It's from the precinct. Chief Wallace wanted you to have it." Marcus opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His heart sank as he realized what he was looking at. Officer Carter's body cam footage, along with a note from Diana that read, "This is only the beginning. We have work to do." Marcus closed the folder, his mind racing, when a shadow appeared in the hallway. A man in plain clothes approached him, his face serious. "Dr. Hall," the man said, "we need to talk. It's about Carter, and it's bigger than you think." Dr. Marcus Hall stood frozen in the hallway, the weight of the folder in his hands making it feel heavier than it should. The man in plain clothes stared at him with a serious intensity, his voice low and deliberate. "My name is Agent Nathan Cole," he said, pulling out an ID badge. "FBI." Marcus blinked, his mind struggling to process the sudden shift in his night. "FBI?" he repeated. "What does the FBI have to do with Officer Carter? Or me, for that matter?" Agent Cole glanced around, his sharp eyes scanning the hallway to ensure they weren't overheard. "This isn't the place to discuss it," he said. "But let's just say Carter's car crash wasn't random, and it wasn't an accident." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there's more going on here than a reckless traffic stop," Cole replied. "We've been investigating Carter and a few other officers in the precinct for months. What you experienced tonight wasn't just bad judgment. It's part of a larger pattern of abuse and corruption." Marcus clenched his jaw, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I already know about the biases and the mistreatment. I've lived it. But are you saying Carter's behavior tonight was deliberate? That he was targeting me?" Cole nodded grimly. "Carter's actions weren't random. He wasn't just pulling you over for speeding. He was following you." Earlier that night, unbeknownst to Marcus, Officer Carter had been monitoring traffic near one of the hospital's affiliated neighborhoods, a predominantly black area that had been flagged in precinct memos as high risk. The memos, while unofficial, encouraged officers to maintain a heavy presence in the area and to act proactively when spotting suspicious activity. When Carter saw Marcus's SUV speeding through, he didn't just see a surgeon rushing to save a life. He saw a man who fit the profile the precinct memos subtly encouraged officers to target. Instead of verifying Marcus's explanation, Carter followed the script, escalating the situation without cause. But what Carter didn't know was that his every move was being watched by the FBI. Back in the hospital, Marcus stared at Cole, his mind racing. "You're telling me the FBI knew this was happening? That you've been watching Carter, and you didn't step in sooner?" Cole's expression remained calm, but serious. "It's not that simple. We've been building a case against Carter and several others in the department. We needed evidence, something solid to expose the network they're part of." "Network?" Marcus repeated, his stomach twisting. "What kind of network?" Cole hesitated, then said, "A group of officers who've been manipulating the system for years, targeting specific individuals, fabricating charges, and exploiting their positions for personal gain. It's not just racism. It's a coordinated effort to intimidate and control." Marcus exhaled sharply, his anger bubbling over. "And you let them keep doing this while you built your case? How many lives were destroyed while you sat back and waited for the perfect evidence?" Cole's jaw tightened. "I understand your frustration, Dr. Hall. But if we'd acted too soon, we'd only catch a few of them. We needed the whole operation, the ringleaders, the connections, the people funding this from the shadows." Marcus took a step back, running a hand over his face. "So Carter's crash?" Cole nodded grimly. "We believe someone higher up wanted to silence him. He may have known too much, or he might have been getting cold feet about the operation. Either way, the timing is too suspicious." Meanwhile, Chief Diana Wallace sat beside her daughter, stroking Hannah's hair as she told her a story from her childhood to help her relax. But Diana's mind wasn't on the words she was saying. It was on Carter, the FBI's involvement, and what this meant for her precinct. She had worked tirelessly to change the culture of her department. But hearing Cole's revelations confirmed her worst fears. The corruption ran deeper than she'd realized. And now, it wasn't just her reputation on the line. It was the safety of her community. "Mom?" Hannah's soft voice pulled Diana from her thoughts. "Yes, sweetheart. Are you okay?" Hannah asked, her blue eyes searching her mother's face. "You look worried." Diana forced a smile, leaning down to kiss her daughter's forehead. "I'm okay, honey. You just focus on getting better, all right?" Hannah nodded, but her expression remained concerned. Diana lingered for a moment, then stood. "I'll be right back. I need to check on something." Diana found Marcus and Agent Cole standing near the nurse's station, their voices low but intense. She approached them, her sharp gaze flicking between the two men. "Agent Cole," she said, her tone demanding answers. "Why is the FBI involved in my precinct?" Cole didn't flinch. "Chief Wallace, I was just explaining to Dr. Hall that Carter's actions tonight were part of a larger issue. We've been investigating corruption in your department for months." Diana's expression hardened. "Corruption? In my department? Why wasn't I informed?" "Because we couldn't risk tipping anyone off," Cole replied. "And with all due respect, Chief, some of the officers involved are close to you. We needed to be sure of where your loyalties lie." Diana's nostrils flared, but she kept her voice steady. "My loyalties lie with justice. Always." "Good," Cole said, "because we're going to need your help." Over the next hour, Cole revealed the full scope of the FBI's investigation. Carter had been one of several officers involved in a secretive network that targeted vulnerable communities for personal and financial gain. The network extended beyond the precinct, with ties to local businesses, politicians, and even private contractors who benefited from gentrification efforts. Diana listened in stunned silence, her mind racing as Cole laid out the evidence. Marcus stood beside her, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "So what happens now?" Diana asked finally. Cole looked at her, his expression unyielding. "We bring them down, but it's going to take everything we've got. And we can't do it without you." Diana squared her shoulders, determination shining in her eyes. "You'll have my full cooperation," she said. But as she spoke, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was a text from an unknown number that read, "Be careful who you trust. This goes deeper than you think."